Welcome to Story Planet, where every story is a journey of wonder. The Light Between Us is a quiet love story, two distant lights, one gentle connection, and the calm that comes when two hearts simply stay. Get cozy, relax, and let the story gently unfold. Perfect for unwinding before the night or whenever you need a moment of calm. Noah liked quiet things. He liked the hush of waves in the early hours, before the birds woke up. He liked the way the wind moved through the grass without asking for attention. He liked the sound of his own footsteps echoing up the spiral staircase of the old lighthouse. Most of all, he liked the silence that came after the beacon was lit, the moment when the great glass eye turned outward to sweep across the sea like a slow breath. The lighthouse had been built before Noah was born. It had outlasted storms and time and men with bigger plans. It stood tall and chipped at the edge of the coastline, where the land dropped off into cold, deep water. Years ago, people used to come visit during summer. They took pictures, left behind snack wrappers, and told Noah he had the most peaceful job in the world. Most of them only stayed an hour, but Noah stayed every day. He'd been working here for 3 years, long enough for the beams and pipes to stop creaking in his mind, long enough that the sea air had found its way into his sweaters, his books, his bones. His life had grown into the shape of this place like ivy growing around stone, slow, quiet, and tangled in ways he didn't feel the need to explain. Each evening, he would light the beacon, check the generators, boil water for tea, and sit by the window to read or sketch. Sometimes he tried to write. Sometimes he just stared at the sky and listened to the foghorn moan like an old whale calling home. One night, in early autumn, something changed. It was a clear night, the kind where the stars looked close enough to tap on. The sea was calm, the air cool but kind. Noah made his tea and climbed to the top of the tower, lantern in hand. As the beam turned slowly in its glass shell, Noah scanned the coastline, out of habit more than need. That's when he saw it. A light. Not his own. Not the broad, swinging arc of the beacon. This one was small, steady, and warm. A flicker of gold from a cottage on the distant hill. He hadn't noticed it before. Maybe it had always been there, and he simply never looked at the right time. Or maybe someone had just moved in. Either way, it surprised him. He watched it for a moment, then returned to his chair, pulled a blanket over his lap, and opened a book. But he found himself glancing out the window again and again, waiting to see if the light would vanish. It didn't. It stayed until long after midnight, then blinked out like a sleepy eye. The next night, it was back. Night after night, as Noah lit his beacon, the golden light would appear in the distance. Sometimes it flickered like candlelight, sometimes it glowed steadily, and sometimes it didn't come at all. On those nights, Noah felt something he couldn't name, a soft, strange ache, as though a piece of music had skipped a note he loved. He told himself it was nothing, just a light, probably someone reading late, or painting, or listening to the radio while cooking something cozy on a stove, but something about the quiet glow pulled at him. It became a kind of companion, a little promise in the dark that someone else was awake, someone else was keeping watch in their own way. He began to look for it without thinking, the way people check the moon or hold their breath before a favorite line in a song. Days passed, then weeks. He didn't know who lived in the cottage. The village was small and most people minded their own, but part of him didn't want to ask. It felt like prying into a secret he wasn't supposed to name yet. The mystery was a comfort. It gave him something to wonder about, something kind. Then one night, the light didn't come. It was raining, hard, steady sheets tapping against the lighthouse glass. The sea had turned restless, smudging the horizon into a blur of motion. Noah climbed the stairs, lit the beacon, and waited. But the golden glow across the hill never appeared. He waited longer than usual, sipped his tea slower, told himself that maybe the storm had knocked out power or the person had simply gone to bed early. But something itched in his chest, a worry he didn't understand. For the first time in a long time, Noah felt alone. The next morning, the rain cleared. The sun came out gently, like it was apologizing for the storm. Noah stood at the base of the lighthouse, unsure of what he was doing. He held a small envelope in his hand, sealed with a bit of tape. Inside a note. Just a few words. "Hope you're okay. Your light feels like a friend." From across the water. He had debated whether to sign it. In the end, he didn't. He walked the narrow path that wound along the cliffside and down toward the cottages. The one with the light was easy to find. It looked exactly as he imagined. A bit wild, with ivy on the shutters and a crooked chimney. He slipped the note into the mailbox and walked away without looking back. The next evening, the light was there. Noah saw it as soon as he reached the top of the tower. A soft glow, steady and golden, waiting in the distance like a reply. He let out a breath he hadn't meant to hold. That night, he didn't read. He just sat by the window, warm mug in hand, watching the two lights dance in silence. His, sweeping the sea like a slow heartbeat. Hers, quiet and still, glowing like a promise. He didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in a long while, Noah felt something beginning. Something gentle, something good. Clara didn't plan to answer the note. Not right away, at least. She had found it the morning after the storm, tucked gently in her mailbox like a whisper. The handwriting was small and careful, the kind of writing someone does when they aren't sure if they'll be read. She read the words once, then again, then folded the note and slipped it into her coat pocket, like a secret. It took her the rest of the day to decide how she felt. The truth was, she had seen the lighthouse too. Every night since she'd arrived at the cottage, she had watched the tall white tower blink its soft, sweeping light over the sea. It reminded her of something. Maybe her father's old reading lamp, which he left on until she fell asleep, or the way fireflies used to float by the porch of their summer cabin, something gentle and steady, something alive. She hadn't lit the lantern in her window for anyone in particular. It was an old habit. When she painted, she liked the way the shadows shifted across the room. Candles helped her focus, and the oil lantern she'd found in the attic gave off a soft, golden glow she liked better than the sharp buzz of electric light. But she had started leaving it on a little longer each night. Now she wondered if someone had been watching. Not in a bad way. Not in the way that made her want to close curtains and hide. But in the way that made her feel seen, gently, from a distance. She kept the note in her pocket all week, taking it out when the nights felt long. Eventually she wrote something back. It wasn't much, just a folded square of paper with a few lines. "I see you too." The girl with the lantern. She didn't sign her name. She didn't explain herself. She just placed the note on a flat stone at the base of the lighthouse one morning and walked away before the breeze could change her mind. That night, she lit her lantern again. Across the water, the lighthouse blinked slowly. Clara sat by the window and painted, but her hands moved with something lighter now. The loneliness hadn't left, but it was no longer so heavy. The next evening, another note appeared. This time inside a jar, weighted with a smooth stone. "I'm glad you wrote back. This light has kept me company more nights than I can count." Clara smiled without meaning to. They wrote to each other often after that. Not every day, not in a rush. The letters were short, but thoughtful. small windows into the quiet worlds they lived in. He told her about a bird that kept landing on the tower railings. She told him about the muffins she burned that made the whole house smell like charcoal and cinnamon. He wrote about the fog rolling in like a slow breath. She sent him a sketch of the lighthouse, drawn from her window. They never signed their names. Somehow that made the letters easier to write. There was no pressure to impress, no need to be anything more than exactly what they were. Strangers, sort of. Not really. Not anymore. One afternoon, Clara walked to the mailbox and found a note tied with a thin blue string. If you could live anywhere in the world, would you stay where you are? She sat with that one for a long time. Her first instinct was to say no. Her life before the cottage had been loud, fast, full of people and plans and expectations. She had come here to get away from it, to try and paint again, to remember what still felt like hers after losing her father. But something about this quiet place, the hush of the waves, the pull of the tides, the warmth of one steady light across the sea had settled into her. That night, she answered honestly, "For now, this is the only place that feels right. I think I'm still learning how to stay." She didn't know if he would understand. But he did. His next letter read, "I came here because the world was too loud. I thought silence would fix me. But I think it's the stillness that's done the healing." Clara read that line over and over again. She copied it into her journal, drew around it, let it rest in the space between her ribs. One foggy night, when the sea was too thick to see through, she lit her lantern and placed it outside near the porch. Not just in the window this time, in the open, like an offering, a soft, glowing heart against the gray. She sat in her coat with a blanket on her shoulders and waited. And there it was, a soft beam of light sweeping across the clouds, painting a faint arc over the water. Still there, still steady. That night, she wrote only one sentence, "Thank you for keeping watch." The next letter came folded in the shape of a boat. Inside, "You keep me anchored." She didn't need more. There are certain kinds of fog that don't just cover the sea, they settle inside you. Noah had grown used to weather. Storms, squalls, the ache of rain against the windows like someone knocking gently from the other side. But this fog was different. It came without sound, without wind, like the world had pressed pause on everything except breath. Even the lighthouse beam had to work harder, its arc slicing into a gray nothing that swallowed most of it whole. Noah sat beside the window, watching the beam vanish again and again. He imagined it like a hand reaching for something it couldn't quite find. He hadn't received a note in 4 days. Clara's lantern had stayed dark. At first, he told himself not to worry. People had moods. Days got busy. Maybe she'd gone into the village. Maybe she needed time. He understood what silence could mean. It didn't always mean something was wrong. But by the 4th day, he felt it. That familiar twist of doubt, sharp and sudden, curling behind the ribs. He tried to distract himself. He organized tools, tightened bolts on the railing, cleaned the glass of the lens. But her absence sat beside him like a chair left pulled out at the table. Obvious, waiting. That night, the sea was restless, not wild, but uneasy. Waves slapped the shore with a rhythm that didn't seem to match the sky. Noah climbed the tower as usual, hand on the railing, stepped steady, but his mind not fully in his body. He reached the top, lit the beacon, and stood beside it longer than usual. He waited. Nothing. No light from the hill, no warmth from her window, just fog and the echo of wind. When he finally turned to go, his foot missed the top step. The fall wasn't far, but it was sudden. His hand slammed the railing. His shoulder struck cold metal. The lantern clattered down the stairs, extinguishing with a hiss. Noah lay on the floor, stunned. His elbow throbbed. His ankle ached, his breath caught in his throat, not from pain, but from something else, something older. He hadn't had a panic attack in nearly 2 years. But now, in the silence, with the fog pressing against the windows and no familiar light to reach for, he felt it coming back. The room shrank. His chest tightened, his fingers curled into fists without asking. He closed his eyes and tried to slow everything down, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Like his therapist had taught him years ago, back when his life was still lit by fluorescent lights and crowded train stations and office doors that never really closed. He counted backward from 50. By the time he reached 20, something changed. Footsteps, soft, hesitant on the gravel path outside. Then a knock, unsure. He stayed still. Then her voice, muffled but clear. "Noah?" He blinked. His throat clenched. He didn't even remember telling her his name. Maybe she'd asked around. Maybe it had always been waiting in the space between their letters. He tried to speak, but managed only a croak. "Up here." The door creaked open. Footsteps again, firmer now, coming up the stairs. And then she appeared. Wind in her hair, cheeks flushed, lantern in hand. That familiar glow, not from a window now, but close enough to warm the air between them. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head slowly. "Just overwhelmed." Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a wrapped square of chocolate. She pressed it into his hand without a word. The gesture was so simple, so oddly specific, that it made him laugh. Just once, soft and surprised. She smiled, relieved. "I read somewhere that chocolate helps with grounding. Or maybe it was oranges. I had chocolate." He breathed in, the scent of rain and salt and her lantern oil filling the space. "Thank you." They didn't talk much after that. She helped him sit up, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and sat beside him on the metal floor. For a while, they just listened to the wind. Eventually he said, "I thought I lost the light." Clara tilted her head. "You didn't. I mean, I got used to seeing yours. Every night it kept me going. And then—" "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry. I just needed to go quiet for a bit." He nodded. "Me too sometimes." "I didn't want to disappear," she added. "I just didn't have the words for a few days." "I understand." He looked at her. Really looked. "I'm glad you're here. I wasn't sure if I should come, but then the light didn't turn and—" She looked down. "I worried." Noah looked at her lantern. "You brought it with you." She smiled. "I figured it might help." And it did. That night, after making their way downstairs, they sat at the small table in the lighthouse kitchen. She made tea. He found a bandage for his elbow. They didn't rush. Nothing about them needed to be fast. They didn't talk about what they were or what this was. They didn't have to. In the morning, the fog lifted. Clara walked home slowly, her lantern swinging gently by her side. Noah watched from the doorway, shoulder wrapped in a scarf, hands wrapped around a warm mug. The beam of the lighthouse didn't turn that morning, but the light between them had never burned brighter. Winter arrived quietly. The first snow came overnight, soft and silent, blanketing the world in a hush. Clara woke to find the garden dusted in white and the window panes edged in frost. She lit the stove, wrapped herself in a thick cardigan, and stood by the window with her tea, watching the lighthouse beam swing slowly across the morning light. It had been a month since the fog. Since she found Noah on the cold floor of the tower. Since they'd sat beside each other in the half-dark and said things without needing to say much at all. They hadn't labeled anything. There were no declarations, no dramatic shifts, just more moments. More tea, more notes, though now they delivered them by hand. Sometimes folded into napkins during shared breakfasts, sometimes pinned to the door with magnets shaped like stars. Noah had repaired an old room on the bottom floor of the lighthouse. It had once been used for storage, but now it had a large wooden desk by the window, a shelf for her sketchbooks, and a basket for blankets. Clara had started spending her afternoons there, sketching in the warm hush of salt and sun. She said the quiet helped her draw again. Noah said it was the sound of her pencil on paper that helped him breathe easier. They didn't spend every moment together. Clara still loved her solitude. Noah still needed space to be quiet in. But there was comfort in knowing that the other was nearby, that at any given moment they could meet on the path between their homes and walk together, no destination needed. One evening, just after twilight, Clara arrived at the lighthouse with something wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to him shyly, cheeks pink from the cold. "For you," she said. Noah unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a lantern, not the one she had used before. This one was new, but familiar. She had painted tiny stars along the glass, each one unique. Inside, a small flicker of flame danced like it recognized the room. "I thought you should have your own," she said. "A lantern that isn't just a signal or a habit, one that's just yours." Noah didn't speak for a moment. Then he said simply, "It's beautiful." He placed it on the table beside the window and lit it that night instead of the overhead bulb. It cast a golden glow across the room, soft and warm, like company. Like care. The days grew shorter. Snow came again, heavier this time. The sea darkened into a moody gray, and wind began to hum around the tower like an old lullaby. Noah added more wood to the stove. Clara learned to make bread. Badly at first. He ate every burnt crust anyway. They began writing again, even though they now saw each other daily. Not letters exactly, more like small observations scribbled on scraps of paper, notes left in coat pockets or inside books. "Your laugh came out like a song this morning." "The sea smelled like cinnamon today. Is that possible?" "You are more lighthouse than you know." They never stopped calling each other by their old names. The girl with the lantern, the light across the water. It had become a kind of poetry between them, a shared myth that still felt true. One night, as the year edged toward its close, they sat on the balcony at the top of the lighthouse, bundled in scarves and coats, watching snow drift down over the ocean like ash from a soft fire. Below them, the world was quiet. No boats, no wind, just breath and stillness. Clara leaned her head against Noah's shoulder. He didn't move. "I used to think," she said, "that love had to be loud to be real, that it needed fireworks, chases, grand speeches, but I don't think that anymore." Noah looked down at her. "What do you think now?" "That maybe love is just staying, not going anywhere when it gets quiet." He nodded slowly, letting the truth of that settle, "and letting someone else stay too," he said, "even when you're not sure how long it will last." The lantern glowed beside them, steady and bright. A second light joined it, her old lantern lit again in her cottage window. She had left it on a timer, just in case they looked back. They always did. Later, as they walked back down the stairs, Clara asked, "Do you ever miss it? The life before this?" Noah thought about the noise, the blur of days, the walls that felt too thin and the nights that felt too long. "No," he said, "not the way I used to live it. I think I needed to lose the world a little to find the pieces that mattered." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't fade quickly. In the weeks that followed, they built a small bench near the edge of the bluff where the lighthouse met the sea. On clear mornings, they'd bring coffee and sit together, wrapped in quilts, watching the day unfold in silence. The lighthouse still shone its light every night, but now so did the cottage. Two small beacons watching over the world, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And in between them, something grew, not rushed, not loud, just real. a light between them that never dimmed. Thank you for listening. If you liked the story, consider giving it a thumbs up and sharing it with your loved ones. They might need a moment of calm too. For daily stories, subscribe if you haven't already. Good night and sweet dreams from Story Planet.